Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to the B segment of episode 55 of Codename Kids Next Door, Operation D.I.A.P.E.R. We begin this segment with the Stork, a 2x4 technology vehicle that resembles the animal of the same name, exiting the Sector V treehouse. 4 of the 5 Sector V operatives are in the Stork right now. Number 5 is the absent operative, and they're on their way to the location of their latest mission. Number 1 explains to the 3 other present Sector V operatives that he suspects that adults kidnap babies and use the nurseries in hospitals in order to quickly change babies into adults while robbing them of what Number 1 calls glorious childhood. So they intend to go to the hospital to liberate the babies in order to give them a chance at childhood. Eventually, the Stork arrives at the hospital, and Number 2 stays in the Stork while Number 3, Number 4, and Number 1 storm the hospital using 2x4 technology weapons to trap the adults inside, whether they be patients or staff members of the hospital, including Number 5's dad, Dr. Lincoln. Eventually, Number 1, Number 3, and Number 4 find the nursery and contact Number 2 to let him know. So, Number 1, Number 2, Number 3, and Number 4 coordinate in order to bring all of the babies into the Stork, and the Stork returns to the Sector V treehouse. The next scene shows Number 1, Number 3, and Number 4 have brought the babies into Number 4's room, much to Number 4's dismay, who questions why his room has to be the room where the babies are right now. And Number 1 answers that they all have to make sacrifices in the name of fighting adult tyranny. And afterwards, Number 5 arrives, and she's frustrated that her teammates went ahead with the mission regarding the babies. She tries to explain to them that babies are supposed to be in hospitals, but Number 1 dismisses Number 5's comments by calling them conspiracy theories. Number 5 then inquires Number 1 about what they plan to do with the babies now that they're out of the hospital. And Number 1 responds that Number 2 is currently forging IDs for the babies, and they plan to set the babies free so that they can experience the activities of childhood, which they think they wouldn't be able to experience if they were in the hospital, because they believe that the hospitals try to turn babies into adults quicker. Number 5 then inquires if Number 1 even knows where babies come from, and Number 1 answers that they come from baby eggs. Number 5 then says that she's going to tell the other present Sector V operatives where babies actually come from, because she was baffled by Number 1's answer, or she found Number 1's answer to be ridiculous. But before Number 5 has the chance to say anything else, the babies begin to cry. Number 1 blames Number 5 for the babies crying, and Number 5 storms off saying that they can figure out how to take care of the babies by themselves, and Number 1 angrily retorts that they will. So Number 1, Number 3, and Number 4 try to figure out how to get the babies to stop crying. Number 3 says that she speaks the baby language, and she begins to talk to one of the babies, the baby who's wearing a yellow onesie and a red hat. According to Number 3's translation, when she's, after Number 3 talks to the baby, she then tells Number 1 and Number 4 what the baby said. Apparently, the baby's name is Jackson, and he wants to play with a particular rainbow monkey toy. He also says something about tuna fish and armpits. So Number 1, Number 3, and Number 4 continue to try to figure out how to get the babies to calm down and stop crying, but their attempts are not very successful, to say the least. Eventually, number 5 returns to number 4's room and decides to take matters into her own hands. So number 5 begins to cradle Jackson in her arms, and she sings a lullaby which does indeed put the babies to sleep. Number 1 says that since number 5 has got this handled, he's going to go check and see how number 2 is doing with the forged IDs for the babies. Number 3 says that she's going to go get that rainbow monkey toy that Jackson wanted to play with, and number 4 doesn't give a very good reason. He just says he's going to be somewhere else. So after those Sector V operatives leave, number 5 begins to talk, partially to herself, partially to the babies, but essentially number 5 says that she has to figure out a way to return the babies to the hospitals before their parents notice that they're gone. Although number 5 also admits that number 1 won't be happy that she's defying one of the Kids Next Door missions. Later on, we see the 4 other Sector V operatives in the hallway. Yes, they're walking down the hallway. Number 2 has finished the forged IDs for the babies. And when the 4 present Sector V operatives return to number 4's room, they find that the babies are gone. Number 1 figures that number 5 probably tried to bring the babies back to the hospital. So number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4 head to number 2's room, because number 2's room is also the hangar of the Sector V treehouse. When the 4 present Sector V operatives arrive in number 2's room, they do find the babies, but they don't see number 5 anywhere. And number 1 starts to go on a rant about how he thinks number 5 had fled, and he essentially calls number 5 a traitor during his rant. Number 3 says that number 1 should be careful about what he says around the babies, but number 1 doesn't really take this warning seriously. Number 1 says it doesn't matter because they're just babies. They don't understand what he's saying. But then an unfamiliar voice actually voices agreement with what number 3 said, and we see that this unfamiliar voice is coming from Jackson, who now has teeth in his mouth. And yes, the sight of teeth in a baby's mouth is rather unsettling, to say the least. The 4 present Sector V operatives then look up at the ceiling and they notice number 5 is trapped. Yes, number 5 is trapped hanging from the ceiling, and she doesn't have her teeth anymore. She's trying to talk, but yes, we can't understand what she's saying. Number 1 questions Jackson about why he took number 5's teeth, and Jackson starts to go on a rant about his and his friends' motives. Jackson refers to the group of babies that he's a part of. He calls he and his friends and himself, he calls their group the ankle biters. And Jackson goes on a rant about how with teeth, babies will be able to eat real food, and they'll be able to talk, which means that they won't have to deal with baby talk from adults anymore. And Jackson actually calls the Sector V operatives adults. So after he finishes his rant, Jackson then tells his fellow ankle biters to attack. So the cribs that the ankle biters are in, they turn into vehicles of their own. So essentially baby versions of the 2x4 technology that we see with the Kids Next Door. So a fight breaks out between the Sector V operatives and the ankle biters. And eventually, eventually, number 1 is able to free number 5 from the ceiling that she's trapped on. Yes, number 1 frees number 5 and gets her out of the ceiling. Essentially, number 1 frees number 5 from what's trapping her on the ceiling. And number 2, number 3, and number 4 are defeated by the ankle biters. Number 2, number 3, and number 4 have their teeth taken and they're rendered unconscious. So Jackson tells number 1 that number 1 is the only one left of the Sector V operatives who still has his teeth, or still has their teeth. And Jackson intends to take number 1's teeth too. So number 1 and number 5 try to run away, and Jackson tells the ankle biters to assemble their vehicles. So yes, the ankle biter vehicles all join together and they look like a giant mechanical centipede, essentially. That's the best way I can think to describe their combined vehicle form. So number 5 is starting to activate all sorts of devices to create noise while she's running with number 1. Number 1 doesn't understand what number 5 is trying to do, especially because he can't understand number 5 without her teeth. Yes, he can't understand number 5 since number 5 doesn't have her teeth anymore. But eventually, number 1 and number 5 head to number 5's room, and number 1 manages to figure out, thanks to charades, number 1 manages to figure out that number 5 thinks that their best course of action is to put the babies to sleep in order to defeat them. So once they arrive in number 5's room, the ankle biters follow afterwards and they break through the door and try to get into the room. Number 5 then activates some music, and then she tosses a microphone to number 1, pretty much trying to tell number 1 that he has to sing the babies to sleep, sing the lullaby that number 5 sang earlier. Number 1 is nervous. He insists that he's not much of a singer, but when the ankle biters enter number 5's room, number 1 has no choice but to start the lullaby. And yes, number 1's version of the lullaby is not very, it's not sung very well, to say the least. But it still seems to work. The ankle biters seem to be put to sleep by number 1 singing the lullaby. Number 1 seems to have more confidence now in his singing ability, but number 5 takes her teeth back from the sleeping Jackson and puts them back in her mouth so number 5 can talk again, or we can understand number 5 again. And number 5 tells number 1 that his singing merely knocked the babies out rather than actually put them to sleep. But number 1 brushes this off and tries to insist that they sing a little more karaoke with some time to spare. So eventually we see the stork, and yes, the stork returns to the hospital and brings the babies back to the nursery. And after the babies are brought back to the nursery in the hospital, the stork heads off back to the Sector V treehouse. Number 5 angrily questions number 1 about what he said before about calling number 5 a traitor. Number 1 nervously tries to change the subject by questioning number 5 about where babies come from. And number 5 begins to give an answer. And then the next scene is the scene that plays alongside the end credits. So the end credits scene jumps ahead after number 5 gives her answer, and we see the 4 other Sector V operatives having horrified expressions on their faces, or surprised looks on their faces, or a combination of those expressions. But then number 1 says that number 1 thinks it's ridiculous that babies apparently come from New Jersey. The segment ends with number 1 insisting that babies come from Philadelphia. So there you go. This segment actually carries over a storyline that was hinted at in an earlier segment. In Season 3's Operation Hospital, we do see number 1 coming across a nursery while he was searching through the hospital. And that small scene ended up playing into this segment. Or we can figure or piece together that number 1 probably tried to look into babies in hospitals after after the events of Operation Hospital, and eventually came to the conclusion that he came to in this segment, Operation Diaper, and why he wanted to set off on this particular mission, or why he wanted to begin this particular mission. It's not made exactly clear where Number One came to that conclusion, or how Number One came to the conclusion that he did, but I guess some fan works will probably try to fill in those blanks. But yes, you could say that this segment could be considered an example of, this segment would be a good example of most of the Sector V operatives being seen as heroic versions of the well-intentioned extremists. 4 of the 5 Sector V operatives honestly believed that they were doing a good thing by getting babies out of the hospitals, because they genuinely believed that the hospitals would rob babies of their childhood, and they wanted to give babies their chance at childhood. Although, yes, Number 5 was the only Sector V operative who realized that, no, babies being in the hospital is not a bad thing. Babies don't lose their childhood from being in the hospital. And I forgot to mention this in the recap part, but while Number 5 was trying to explain this to the Sector V operatives, she actually brought up that she has an older brother who has kids of his own. So this is an interesting detail. We find, because yes, in previous entries, we had no reason to believe that Number 5 and Cree weren't the only Lincoln siblings. Or yes, previous entries only suggested that Number 5 and Cree were the only Lincoln siblings, but this segment does reveal that Number 5 and Cree actually have an older sibling, an older brother, old enough that he's an adult, and he's old enough to have kids of his own. Unfortunately, we never get to meet Number 5 and Cree's older brother. We never get to meet him. We never get to see his own family, and we never even get to learn his name. Maybe, if we're lucky, maybe the sequel series will introduce him. That's, of course, assuming that the sequel series ever does get greenlit. But yes, I would definitely be in favor of meeting the older brother of Cree and Number 5. And that's right, now that I think about it, they never really clarify if the older brother of Number 5 and Cree was a Kids Next Door operative. We just know that he's old enough to be an adult now. Now, we don't know exactly what age he is. Like, we don't know if he's in, like, his early 20s, late 20s, or his 30s. It's not made really clear. But, yes, there's definitely some questions about... we don't know too much about Number 5 and Cree's older brother, but I suppose there's probably some fan works out there that try to offer different explanations. And like I said, hopefully we will eventually have more explicit answers regarding the oldest of the Lincoln siblings. Now, the other big detail with this segment is the ankle biters. We actually get to see a group of antagonists that are babies, and I remember some fans finding it very weird to have babies as antagonists. Or yes, they thought it was strange that antagonists were babies, even by the standards of Codename Kids Next Door. Or they thought this was weird even by Codename Kids Next Door standards. Then again, we have seen Number 4's baby brother, Joey, who is a prodigy dodgeball player, so this isn't the only time we've seen weird things from babies in this series. And yes, Joey is also a good example that shows us not all babies are bad. Although I have seen some fans actually bring up that the ankle biters could be, some different fans have offered alternate character interpretations about the ankle biters. Jackson's comments about calling the Sector V operatives adults in particular, that particular line seems to be what inspired some of this alternate character interpretation from different fans. But yes, other fans have pointed out that the ankle biters kind of reminded them about how the Sector V operatives acted back in Season 1. Season 1 was the season where the Sector V operatives came off less sympathetic or less heroic. It wasn't really until season 2 when the Sector V operatives were portrayed in a much more heroic light, or maybe as early as the end of season 1 anyway. But some fans did feel that the ankle biters kind of reminded them of the early installment weirdness with the way how the Sector V operatives initially acted in season 1, or at least the beginning of season 1. And in any case, though, some fans did say that the ankle biters and the kids next door had some not so different moments. So yeah, the ankle biters, they don't really return again, or maybe they have cameo appearances. They might have cameo appearances later on, but this is at least their only prevalent major role in the series from what I remember. But they still managed to lead to some speculation about how they view the Sector V operatives. Like, are they really antagonists, or did the ankle biters simply think that the Sector V operatives were bad guys because they called the Sector V operatives adults? It definitely. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if some fan works were inspired to look deeper into the ankle biters. I'm sure there's some fan works about the ankle biters floating around somewhere on the internet. And I guess the only other detail I can think of worth bringing up, or major detail that I think should be covered, is number 1 singing. Some fans noticed that this is inconsistent with how number 1 was portrayed in the season 4 segment Operation Love, where number 1 was shown to be a capable singer. Yes, number 1 wasn't portrayed as a terrible singer in Operation Love like he was in this segment, Operation D.I.A.P.E.R. Some fans, though, figured, or some fans have offered explanations along the lines of maybe it's because number 1 didn't really have time to practice number 5's lullaby. Maybe number 1 just needs a lot of practice with certain songs, or maybe number 1's nervousness and stress was getting the better of him because of how close the ankle biters were to attacking him in number 5. So there's at least some explanations from some fans to explain away that inconsistency. I suppose that's up to fans to decide which interpretation or which explanation they want to go with. So otherwise, I would say that's about it for this particular segment. So we got to have a story that actually came from a detail from an earlier segment. So that was a nice example of the series' serialized nature. And we did get a little detail about one of the Sector V operatives' families by finding out that number 5 and Cree have an older brother, although we unfortunately don't get to hear too much else about him. And like I said, I'm hoping we might get to hear more about him in the future if the sequel series ever does see the light of day. And yes, the ankle biters definitely offer some alternate character interpretations depending on how you view them in the antagonist spectrum, whether you think of them as actual evil babies, or if they simply thought themselves to be good and viewed the Sector V operatives as bad guys just because they consider the Sector V operatives to be adults. But yes, this segment does have some notable details to it, but otherwise I would say that's about it. So as of this video, we've now discussed the B segment of episode 55 of Codename Kids Next Door on this channel. Take care, and until next time,